Serious, what's the creepiest experience you've ever had while camping? My girlfriend at the time and I went camping 5 hours away from home for her birthday/our anniversary. We made the trip the day after a big storm passed through. We left town early and got there in the early afternoon. The guy at the entrance to the campgrounds mentioned there was no one else staying there that weekend. We were like, oh, this is gonna be sick. First, we drove down these long pathways to our designated area. As you got closer to it, the road narrowed. So basically, you had to back out to get out. We unloaded the car, got the tent set up, and decided to go walk around the woods. It was dead silent. But it was still bright out, so we just took in all the nature we could and walked a few miles away. We reached this point in the woods where there were some weird-looking white cabins. They were very uniform, all built the exact same way. Like, I guess they were a part of the camping grounds, but they seemed way out of the way, and there was no sign of life. It felt eerie to be at, like we shouldn't be there, so we turned around and walked back. We took a breather in the tent, then tried to start a fire in the fire pit. Unfortunately, neither of us had ever been camping before, and had no idea how to start a fire. We had bought some of those self-lighting logs from Walmart and some lighter fluid. But everything else around us was soaked to the bone from the rain that had passed through the day before. We knew we needed kindling of some sort, but any dry sticks or leaves was far and few between. Eventually, we got a small fire going and ate hot dogs and marshmallows and spent some time looking at the stars. Then we noticed just how dark it was out there. My girlfriend was easily spooked and was like, "Can we get into the tent now?" So we put the fire out and crawled into the tent. We were talking to each other, but I could tell she was tense. Suddenly, she put her hand over my mouth and was like, "Shh, do you hear that?" Before I could respond, we heard footsteps. Like, heavy footsteps. It sounded like a group of people walking. I whispered to her, "It's probably just animals or something." Then we heard mumbling. Like, low mumbling. We couldn't make out words, but it didn't sound like a sound an animal could make. It sounded like words but hushed and non-elaborated. We sat in silence staring at each other in the dark for what felt like forever. The mumbling got louder, as did the footsteps, until it sounded like it was right outside of our tent. We both froze. I don't think either of us were breathing, and then silence. We waited and waited and waited. I'm still not sure how much time passed. Eventually, my girlfriend said, "We have to get to your car." The adrenaline was pumping, so I peeked out of the tent into the darkness and told her to stay behind me. Then we ran to the car. I locked the doors and she was like, "WTF was that? We can't stay here. No one is out here but us." What was that? I kept looking around for any signs of life, but we were seemingly alone. I looked at her and was like, "Okay. I'm gonna grab our stuff, you stay in the car." We only had our ice chest and our tent out. I hopped out and ran, grabbed our ice chest, tossed it into the back seat. As I turned around to go get the tent, I started hearing footsteps closing in again. In a moment of pure terror, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped the tarp around it, and slung it over my shoulder like some panicked Santa Claus and shoved it into the trunk. I didn't say anything when I got in the car except, "Do we have everything in here?" My girlfriend said yes and I floored it in reverse out of our camping area. Then we came to a fork in the road that went in like 6 different directions. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered which path we came down to get in here and she told me she didn't know. We chose a random one and ended up in a different camping spot. I cursed under my breath and slammed it into reverse again. Then I noticed from the angle we had exited from, I could see the main path back to the gate, thanks to a small sign behind an overgrown bush. As we hightailed it out of there, I noticed there was a single, small green light out in the woods to our right, near where our designated spot was. We drove the entire 5 hours back to our hometown and fell asleep on my girlfriend's parents' couch at around 4 a.m. We never talked about the trip ever again, and I haven't had any desire to camp since lol. When I was a kid, we used to go on camping trips in the summer with my parents' caravan. One year, my sister and I decided that we wanted to sleep in a small tent instead, which was set up directly in front of the caravan. We didn't even make it one night. Every now and then the both of us clearly heard the sound of something rubbing against the tent. We were scared shitless, because we thought someone was walking around our tent. I don't remember how we got out of the tent. I guess we started screaming for our parents at one point or something. My father took a look around and we tried again, but after a while, Heard the same sounds again. We ended up sleeping in the caravan anyway. A few days later we still didn't want to sleep in the tent, so my father started to disassemble it. Turns out, some animals built tunnels directly under the tent and in doing so, rubbed against the bottom wall. We didn't notice anything, because we were lying on inflatable mattresses. We only heard the sound of them rubbing against the wall. It's pretty funny now, but damn were we creeped out at the time. I was camping in the woods one weekend. When I got up in the morning, someone had made a cup of tea and partially drank it and left out next to my fire. It was a solo camp. Was out camping with a cousin of mine and I was asleep in my tent. In the middle of the night I felt something touching and slithering in me. I ignored it at first, believing that I was still home and it was my brother or some shit, but then when I finally realized where I was and opened my eyes, it was a caterpillar. Scariest shit I've experienced in my whole life. Was out with a friend for a weekend camping trip in the middle of nowhere, North Georgia. We stopped at a local grocery store to stock up on snacks and beer when we found out it was a dry county. We asked the cashier if there was a nearby county where we could buy beer. She gave us directions to a bar that was right across the county line, about a 10-minute drive, so we decided that if we couldn't buy beer we would just stop and have a couple before heading to the campsite. We followed the directions that she gave us, and as it was getting dark we pulled up to a building with no signs saying it was a bar and had all of its windows bricked in. It had a single light bulb over the screen door entrance and it seemed to be the only light around. We sat in the car for a minute and made several nervous jokes about the movie Deliverance, then decided that we didn't need a drink after all. The next day we were chatting with other campers at the site we were staying at, who seemed to be locals, and we mentioned the bar. A couple of them told us independently that that place was not and has never been a bar and that they thought we were being lured into trouble. I think I have the creepiest story. We used to have a stationary caravan on a campground right at the Northern Sea. The campground was very small. There were like 40 to 50 caravans stationed there and a few empty slots for people with tents. We stayed there for holiday one year and for some reason left a day earlier than we had planned, and in that particular night, someone got murdered right next to our caravan. It was two women sleeping in a rented caravan, and the ex-boyfriend of one of the women went to that camping ground at night and stabbed his ex and her friend. They dragged themselves out of the caravan and died right next to our caravan. Our caravan was on the first page of all newspapers, was in the news on TV. It was crazy. Hadn't we left a day early, we'd have seen that women die. When I was in high school, my friends and I went out to a really remote spot in the mountains to camp. Just to get there, you needed a pretty serious off-roader. It was about 30 miles up a super rough road. There were river crossings, huge boulders in the road, and tons of sand pits. This road took us all day. And all day we didn't see a single other person. No one passed us, we didn't see anyone camping. Nothing. At one point, one of my friends noted it looked like no one had even driven on the road in a while. Which was weird, because this was in Colorado and roads/trails like this are really popular. Something worth pointing out, this road led into a box canyon, which is basically nature's cul-de-sac. The road we were on was the only road in, and the only road out. All around us was massive cliffs. And another thing, we were deep in the mountains, far from any cell service. On top of that, we were in a box canyon, which even if you're next to a city, never has service. All that said, we eventually got to the spot and set up camp. Every time we went camping, we played Capture the Flag. This trip was no exception. We waited for it to get dark, then started. In the middle of the second round, me and one of my friends, on my team, hop up on the road, which ran parallel to area we were playing in. It seemed like a good way to get around to the other flag. Walking down road, we began to see a glow coming towards us. Our first thought was it's another 4x4 coming towards us. But as it got closer, we realized it was a young woman holding up her phone, looking for service. She was still at a distance, but we could tell she was panicky. She was rushing and stumbling at the same time. She didn't seem drunk. It was weird. We called out, "Hello?" No response. But it wasn't just that she ignored us. It was more like she didn't even realize we were there. We tried again, "You okay?" Nothing. As she's passing us, we realize she's crying. Again, "You okay?" She stumbles right past us, never showing a single sign that she saw us. The whole time, just looking at her phone for service. My friend and I are frozen. We watch her go. Still stumbling, still crying. She rounded a turn, then disappeared. I yell out to my everyone else to meet back at camp. We do. I tell them what we saw. And I'm not proud to admit this, because it seemed like she needed help, but we got creeped out. We said we'd stay in camp that night, and in the morning, we'd go looking. The first thing we do in the morning is decide there must be some other people camped down the road. They must know her. So we go down to the end of the road. There's no sign of anyone. Then we decided to go to the entrance of the road and look for the woman. So we drive to the entrance, which took all day. Nothing. I still feel guilty for not trying harder to help her. But thinking about how she got in that position, it just doesn't make sense. She didn't look like a hiker, she had on regular jeans and a sweater. If she had gotten in the canyon from the other side, it would require a very technical descent. She would have needed gear, and she didn't even have a backpack. We were pretty sure we were the only ones that had driven down that road in a while, so it's not like someone dropped her off or left her. And the whole time we saw her, she was holding up her phone looking for service. If she knew the area at all, she would know there was no way she was going to find service. I don't know what to make of it. But I do know that the image of that woman stumbling in the dark, crying, has been seared in my brain ever since. When I was a teen, me and two friends went camping and woke up in the middle of the night to a knife scraping along the sides on the tent at waist height. It went on for what was probably only a minute but felt like a lifetime. Then it stopped and we waited maybe an hour and left without unpacking the tent. Later that week we found out it was one of our friends that we hadn't invited. She had followed us and waited. Creepy AF. Added for more context, the friend in question, S, admitted that it was her when accusing us of being bad friends for not inviting her along. She had no remorse for what she did and just laughed it off. I have no contact with her and haven't for years, but this post had made me wonder where she is now. I always felt really bad for her even though I didn't fully comprehend her situation at home until I was older. Her mom was an alcoholic, her dad showed up every few months and banned her from leaving the house. He also used to sneak into her bedroom at night. She broke his fingers once and he didn't show back up for a long time. S had a kind of OCD where she had to turn taps, light switches, open and close doors etc. a certain amount of times, and she always had to navigate streets the same way. Her number changed every Sunday. On a good week it would be 3, on a bad week she would always be late because the number was so high. After writing this, I am the one who feels so bad about the camping incident. She probably felt abandoned by us and that's why she did what she did. I was in the Sierra Nevada many years ago by myself, tucked away in my sleeping bag when the entire sky lit up a bright red. I put on my glasses and saw a giant red ball slowly blazing across the night sky towards Earth. I thought either the alien invasion has finally started or humanity was going to follow in the footsteps of the dinosaurs. My dad and grandpa like to fish and hunt a lot. One night they decided to spend the night on the river in the Appalachian Mountains. It was really late and they said they heard these awful screams coming from the woods on the opposite side of the river. He said it was inhuman and definitely not a mountain lion or anything like that. He would know. My dad is a pretty big guy and doesn't scare very easily. But in that moment he was frozen with fear and just held his breath until the screams finally stopped. He felt like whatever it was knew that they were there, and wasn't happy about it. It gives him goosebumps just thinking about it. Needless to say, they won't fish there at night anymore. I once woke my husband up to tell him there was a bear trying to get in the tent. I did this while asleep. I had no recollection of it whatsoever in the morning. Not my experience but my mom's, and the reason she didn't let any of my siblings and I go camping. She had gone camping with her friends sometime in the 80s. It was the first time she had ever gone and she didn't exactly know anything about camping. The way she tells it, her friends picked the most isolated place in the woods that they could so they could drink, underaged, without anyone coming along to check on them. After partying until about 1 in the morning they decided to go down for the night. My mom woke up and had heard some noises and shook her friend awake as she was scared. Her friend just assured her it was animals and normal and to go back to sleep. So she did. The next morning they woke up to large boot prints circling around their tent and campfire. The footprints came from the woods and left in the same direction. They couldn't trace it further because of the foliage. They packed up and left that day even though they were supposed to be there for a week. Apparently they weren't the only ones this happened to, and boot prints were found a number of times over the next 2 years. No one was ever caught doing it. My ex and I went camping with one of her friends a few years back. We were sitting around the fire and drinking when this dude just decided he wanted to join us. Not a mountain man or anything, just one of those weekend outdoorsman types. I'd have been fine if he had introduced himself, or bothered to ask if he could share our fire or something, but no, he just wandered out from the brush and plopped his ass down without a word. We just sat in silence for what felt like hours but was probably less than a minute before he started talking about his day hiking and making random small talk. Years ago my girlfriend and I were teachers, and in June of each year, we would take a group of kids camping. We had a 12-person tent set up on our site, which was right next to a small lake. The site included a picnic table and a fire ring. Part of the trip was telling campfire stories about the Jersey Devil, since the campground was located in an area where there had been many sightings over the years. The kids enjoyed being scared and they couldn't wait to return the following year. This was around the 5th annual trip we had taken, and, up to that point, nothing had happened. On the last night after the stories, when the kids were safely asleep, my GF and I sat by the campfire in beach chairs. We had just bought a new puppy and she was tied to the tent on a long lead so she could run around. Suddenly the logs in the fire collapsed and the light from the fire dimmed considerably. Our propane torch that was on the picnic table dimmed at the same time. It became almost pitch black, and that's when the puppy started to growl. She was right next to me and every hair on her back was standing straight up as she stared into the darkness. Suddenly from out of the water comes this large figure about 20 yards from our site. At first, I thought it was a person, but then it bent over and started running on all fours. I could only see the outline of the thing and the back end was higher than the front. It wasn't a bear or a dog or a deer. It looked and ran like something I had never seen. It was in no hurry as it just trotted by and into the woods near our site. I jumped up and ran to my car and turned on the lights. The car lights lit up our campsite, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I told my GF to wake the kids because we were leaving. She was the braver one and convinced me to stay. We eventually calmed down and turned in for the night. I laid down by the tent opening with a large butcher knife and did not sleep until the sun came up. Nothing like this has ever happened to me before or since, but I swear I saw something that was not a man or an animal. I haven't been back camping since. Went out on a camping/canoe trip with my dad, 2 best friends, and their dads about 20 years ago. We met up with a guide to show us through a more advanced part of the river we were going down. While on the trip we were catching fish during the day and fixing them for dinner, except our guide. He was eating canned fruit and beanie weenies. We all were sharing our meals and different thoughts on how we liked our dinners. One of the evenings was particularly cold and the guide asked to sleep in our tent because we had brought a small portable heater. My dad politely gave an excuse to not let him in the tent but said we would share the heater instead. Fast forward 5 years, we are watching the local news and our guide's face pops up. Turns out he was a child rapist that'd been wanted and they captured him. Went camping with some new friends once, and one demanded he not share a tent with anyone because he sleepwalks. After we had already made the plans that he would share a tent with one friend while my girlfriend and I would have our own. Said whatever, was kind of pissed about it but left it so we could still enjoy the weekend. GF and I shared an awkward tent with basically a rando. That night, I was woken up by my GF who said, "First friend's name is freaking me out." So, I looked outside the tent and dude is just walking in circles. I told her he sleepwalks so we just need to keep an eye on him and make sure he doesn't do anything stupid. Like 30 seconds later, he starts screaming hello? At the top of his lungs. And that goes on for a while. Just standing in the middle of the campsite screaming. At this point we're all awake and watching him like WTF. Then he turns toward the woods, screams hello, and points his pistol into the nothingness, luckily away from us. Now, up to this point I didn't even know he brought his gun. So, I went ahead and got mine out too because I was thinking like shit, he is going to sleep shoot us. But he doesn't. Instead he put his gun down, went into his tent, and went immediately back to sleep. Next morning I asked him what he was doing. Turned out he was not asleep and he thought he had heard coyotes, so his first thought was to wander off by himself into the night instead of waking any of us up. I never camped with him again. A few years later, he made the news for scaring the shit out of an entire campsite one night because he was running through the woods and firing his gun erratically because he saw Bigfoot and was trying to track him down. Really weird guy. I have spent a ton of time in the wood, camping and hunting. I was camping with family and we heard the most horrific and animalistic sound coming through the trees. It was night and we had a lantern. So a small ring of light with pitch black beyond. Our dog shot straight up, hackled, and the terrifying, guttural growling and animal screaming got closer. We all braced for some monster to come spilling from the darkness, adrenaline pumping, dog fighting to break free. Suddenly the animals burst into the light. It was two raccoons fighting. They stopped, looked at us and kinda had the, oh shit look on their faces and kinda sidled back into the darkness. To this day it is still the most terrifying experience I've had in the wood. This happened on a trip a few years ago one night midweek, when the park is usually quieter. I woke up having to use the bathroom around 2 a.m., so I left the trailer to go to the comfort stations. The site was one of those corner sites, so there's a really short trail in the back of the site through the woods before you get to the lights where the washroom is. You can technically go around the front, but I figured I would just cut through there like I usually do to save time because I was tired. As I'm passing the middle of the trail, I hear a light noise that sounds like it's right beside my ear. It sounded like giggling, so I picked up the pace a little bit and started looking for a raccoon or porcupine or something. They make weird noises, but I couldn't see anything or hear any twigs cracking, which I thought was weird. No sign of a person out there either. As soon as the last thought crossed my mind, I swear to this day that I heard something deeper in the woods and a female voice say hello. To say I jumped was an understatement. I sprinted full throttle to the lights, tripped on a log and ripped my pant leg and shin. I made it to the bathrooms alive, feeling painful and kind of stupid. Once I was at the comfort station I did my business, and talked myself out of it being anything unnatural like the good biologist that I am. I figured I must have just misheard a raccoon or something. I didn't really believe in the paranormal, so worst case it was an actual person. I didn't feel like getting jumped by some weirdo while I'm out at night by myself, so I made the decision to take the longer way back in the open road and skip the shortcut. As I passed by the entranceway for the woods, giving it a wide berth if we're being honest, again, I can only tell you what I heard, but I swear as clear as day I heard a whisper that said come back. I think that's the fastest I've ever run in my life. I'm a little embarrassed to say I don't do camp bathrooms at night by myself anymore, but I can't explain what happened. Luckily my family got a new trailer the following season with an indoor bathroom, so it hasn't been an issue since. This past weekend I was camping with some friends and my buddy and I decided to go for a hike to scout for elk because we'll be hunting there next month when the season opens up. So we walked through the woods and eventually wind up back on a 2-track road. My buddy is carrying his 2-year-old daughter and we have a few dogs with us. Then out of nowhere we hear the crack of a rifle shot and the very distinct sound of a bullet passing between us. We were standing about 10 feet apart. Thinking someone was trying to shoot my dog perhaps. She looks like a coyote. I run up the road into a clearing screaming at whoever was shooting to stop shooting because there were people near. I see a guy standing there with a rifle looking dumber than a box of shit, so I pull my pistol out and tell him he almost shot us and he is making a bunch of excuses, even though he's bird hunting with a rifle and not wearing blaze orange. It got pretty heated and he threatened me before my buddy told him to calm down. Plus we had a kid with us and so did this guy, so no point in escalating the situation, but the guy did tell me he'd find me in town even though he was 100% in the wrong in this situation. A large cougar encircled our tent on the West Coast Trail and was sniffing the tent in the middle of the night. In the morning his tracks were all around us in the damp sand. My wife heard it, but I was asleep the whole time. I was camping in Yellowstone on a cold night and I was asleep in my sleeping bag in my tent when I kinda woke up and felt something warm curled up against my legs and I kinda snuggled back down because my dog usually sleeps there. Then I realized I wasn't at home, so it wasn't her, so I slowly lift my head to see what's in my tent. 2 baby cougars had come in my tent and curled up with me. Their mom was curled in the corner. I just laid there. It was magical and scary. At around 5 a.m. they got up and left. Not necessarily creepy, but so scary. Was camping, staring at the stars, when a meteorite flew overhead and towards mountain we were camping near, when it exploded. It was probably a couple of miles away when it popped, but sounded like dynamite going off and lit the sky up to almost daytime levels. My mom's boyfriend watching us. We would never have known, but he couldn't handle it when we all started talking shit about him. All of a sudden he speaks up from the shadows, LMFAO. Went camping with my family when I was little. I remember one night there were bears, probably 2, that came to our campsite in the middle of the night. They came to our tent and I remember seeing their noses pressed up against the tent. My dad stayed up all night with his rifle in his hand. Luckily nothing happened and they just left. I was 10 or 15 miles into the backcountry wilderness with a friend on a multi-day backpacking trip. We were trout fishing for our supper on a small stream fairly close to the timberline. Seemingly out of nowhere, a game warden on horseback materialized just a few yards from where I stood. He dismounted, marched right up to me and demanded to have a look at the contents of my creel. It wasn't a problem, but it was very unnerving, which, I'm sure, was his intent, the way he had apparently stalked and snuck up on us. My friend and I weren't novices at being in the backcountry, so we were both a bit humbled how this man had managed to ambush us, especially given the sparseness of the vegetation available to cover his approach. My heart was racing for quite a while after that encounter and I vowed to get better at maintaining my situational awareness. He was a good man, though. Turns out I did have a fish that was a bit outside the size limit due to my misunderstanding the regulation for that particular stream. The game warden just advised me that I needed to get that fish on the fire and eat it tonight. He would have been within his rights to cite me and confiscate my fishing rod and tackle, which would have really stunk. Back in the day, knowing you might stumble into some grow field would be a problem too. This more or less happened to me backpacking. It was a remote place but went at least once a year. Usually never saw anyone, but once ran into a guy who was just chilling for the summer at a fairly built-up campsite. We chatted for a while and I moved on. Came back a few months later and he had clearly been tending a decent grow. I didn't really get a bad feeling about the guy, but thought it was weird at the time. If I had been law enforcement I doubt he would have friendly. This was probably 5 miles in on foot, but you had to drive through 30 miles of unmapped logging roads. I think in all the years I went I only ran into one other person/group. Back when I was in high school, a buddy and I dated a couple girls from a nearby town. One of the girls' family had a cabin out in the country near a creek that we would hang out at on Friday and Saturday nights. On one of those nights we were hanging out being innocent, smart decision-making teenagers and started hearing weird noises out in the forest. Like crashing through bushes and stuff. We figured it was deer and went back to what we were doing. Then we heard what sounded like something being scraped along the side of the cabin at about the same time a fog started setting in. We were freaked the F out. We waited about 30 minutes or so after the sound stopped and hauled ass out of there. As we got down the road we saw a guy with a 1,000-yard stare just slowly walking down the road all Michael Myers-like. Nothing ever happened but definitely the creepiest thing I've ever experienced. When I was 7 in Florida we went camping near a spring we swam at quite often. I woke up one morning and went down to the spring to wash up and there was a huge gator on the bank that hissed at me. It had to be 15 to 20 feet long. Easily 5x my height. I stopped, and noped right out. While camping with my class on a fun weekend canoeing trip, I woke up at night and heard someone running around outside the tent, and its breathing sounded like what I can only describe, as an adult with my years of experience, as someone trying not to panic or not to cry openly, not quite sobbing but clearly freaking out, sort of wheezing. You know what I mean. It was very clearly a 2-footed creature, but it sounded very small and fast. We were all at least 13 so we weren't that tiny, none of us were. It ran all around the camp in all directions but never touched anything, and then it ran away, its quick steps getting lighter and lighter until it was gone in the distance. I was lying on my back listening the whole time, and then as it left I turned onto my side. And the kid beside me in the tent was awake with her wide eyes staring straight at me, blankly. I was like, "You got woken up too?" And she nodded and then turned over. I asked her about it the next day and she didn't remember. Nobody remembered. I tried to bring it up, but the teacher insinuated that I was just making it up for attention, so I gave up. No idea what it was. If you have an idea let me know. Edit. I have another story. This one probably has an explanation though. I was with my aunt/cousin and their family camping in an old 70s camper by a lake. It had been raining all evening, and the wind was pretty crazy so we were all freaking out a bit as our camper rocked around in the storm. But eventually we got to bed. In the middle of the night I woke up with the moon streaming in through the window on my face. I remember it being really bright, enough to easily read by, so I sat up slowly and looked out the window, with a clear view through the trees to the lake, and the moon had its reflection glittering on the water. It was very beautiful. But on the water seemed to be something that flew around much like a moth or a bug would, in a strange dance where it'd almost touch the water but then go up again. like it was teasing or faking out. It would go around in circles, not evenly or anything but just repeatedly, and if I were to calculate the size of it going by how far out on the lake it was, it'd be about the size of a cat, and I saw its reflection on the water, so it wasn't a bug or a trick of the light. It was difficult to make out what it actually was. It just went around and around, illuminated in the moonlight, until its circles grew wide enough that it went behind the trees. I kept watching hoping it'd come back out again, but it never did. Avid backpacker, trekker and mountaineer. April 2015. I was on a 100 miles adventure in Grand Escalade in southern Utah. I was camped out about 5 miles from Coyote Gulch, and in the middle of the night there was this ear-piercing screech unlike anything I've ever heard before. I've heard most game noises, but this sounded almost artificial and it felt like it was overhead. I was nervous because of the WTF moment, but I popped out of my tent and just saw this colorful swirl in the sky like a Van Gogh paint stroke, and just stood there, jaw dropped, and went right back into my tent, took an assload of melatonin and knocked out. I didn't really question it for a long time. I honestly try to forget it because it just feels weird even thinking about it. My friend and I were in the car ready to leave for a music festival when we got notice it was canceled. We were all ready to go, so we decided to just drive and find somewhere to camp for the weekend instead. We ended up in a sort of summer resort area upstate. It was the end of season, so the place was completely empty. But it was pretty, nice lake and scenery, so we figured we'd stay. There were no pesky families with kids to interfere with the partying we intended to do. The semi-creepy, but friendly attendant assigned us a site, so we drove down to it. We quickly noticed they'd put us in the site that was furthest away from everything. Literally on the edge of the woods, surrounded by empty sites, completely isolated. We thought it was weird, but still, it was what we wanted, to just drink and smoke in the woods in peace. So we set up camp, then effed around until it got dark. As soon as we settled down in the tent and put out the lantern, we heard an unmistakable sound, off to the left of us, where there was nothing but empty campsites, maybe 100 yards away. Someone was slowly and deliberately sharpening an axe or a knife against stone. Long, slow, metallic strokes. Over and over and over. My friend was terrified, but I was laughing, thinking this attendant guy was obviously messing with us city slickers. She insisted we would have heard him coming, and decided to call the check-in booth. He was there. It was almost half a mile away, there's no way he could have gotten there in time, and we could still hear the sharpening sound, and the attendant guy confirmed there was no one in the place except us. We ended the night locked in the car, holding a can of bear mace. My friend fell asleep, but I watched and listened all night. Shortly before sunrise, the noise stopped. The sun came up, and there was nobody around anywhere. Still can't explain it. When I was in Boy Scouts, Pennsylvania, Troop 303, we made a trip to West Point for the annual Army v. Navy game. Our troop was to spend the night in these really run-down old triangular bunkhouses at an old campground about an hour or so away from the school. Our scoutmasters were really shitty people, never really bothering to check the condition of the place beforehand, so we were all surprised by the terrible, musty and wood-rotten interiors. The bunks were rusty and there were dead bugs everywhere. A lot of us wanted to sleep in the cars instead, but the scoutmaster, a particularly shitty guy in the fold of fucktards watching us, called us pussies and told us to man up, so we grabbed our sleeping bags and did as we were told. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, we started hearing a weird chittering. One of us turned on our flashlights and pointed it up at the vaulted ceiling. Bats. Lots of them. Not surprisingly, someone screamed and the whole nest started wigging out. Everyone started panicking and running around, which only made the bats wig out even more. The parents came running from the other bunkhouse when they heard the screams and got a face full of bats when they opened the door. My dad took me out of that troop not too long after that. Girlfriend and I were tent camping and there were maybe only 5 other campers in the campground, all spread apart. Well, in the middle of the night we both awaken because we hear footsteps maybe 20 feet from our tent. We both just lay there dead quiet listening to the footsteps. They were very slow, and not moving around much. No other breathing sounds and it didn't sound particularly heavy. We both thought it was a person. Weirdest part is that after about 30 seconds of that the footsteps just stopped. Like, no trailing off into the distance, nothing. Like they just stopped and that was that. Still don't know how or what that was about. The unfortunately named Meat Cove, Nova Scotia. Very remote, 20 years ago anyway, no services to speak of. One road in is the same road out. Narrow strip of land between forbidding hills and the ocean. The one campground for miles and miles around. We're tuckered out and need a place to crash. The groundskeeper at the front, this old lady who looked like the crypt keeper, she looks us straight in the eye and says you need to leave. Now. No questions asked, we noped out of there, never even got a campsite. When I was a kid, 12-13 or so, I was camping with Ventures, like Boy Scouts, but a bit older, co-ed, and like no parental supervision. We were in a huge national park, a group of 7 of us, all around the same age, 12 to 15. We had a 4-night/5-day hike/camp planned out, and the parents all knew our route and when we were expected back. All of us, despite being young, had multiple years of camping experience, and between 3 and 15 similar camps done. The trip started out pretty awesome. We made camp the first 2 nights at our desired sites. It was beautiful out, and we got up to the typical fun that kids get up to. Third night, all 3 of our planned sites have people in them and we end up setting up maybe a little too close to a group of campers. We get our kitchen set up, dinner made, a fire going, and then people just kinda start hanging out at our camp. To reiterate our ages, the oldest of us is 15. The group starting to mingle with us are all in their early 20s or so. Things start out friendly enough. We're talking about camping, the Algonquin, and the Leafs. We refuse the friendly offers of drinks, and then the pushy ones. The mood turned a bit, and being as young as we are, we're less than tactful about asking to be left alone. Voices were raised, they ended up leaving our camp, then we turned in for the night. I remember hearing their drunken revelry as I fell asleep. At some point in the middle of the night I wake up to screaming and notice my tent is being shaken violently. I got out of my tent with my flashlight, shoeless and disoriented, and took in the chaos for a few seconds. At least 10 fully grown adults are in our camp breaking our tents, throwing our stuff around and screaming. It ended up devolving into a fight, where me and the other 3 boys I went with got beaten pretty badly. I don't remember much of how the assault ended, but apparently when things were dying down they were saying super creepy, sexual, and threatening shit to the girls. We packed up to leave before the sun rose, and walked the first couple hours of the trail by flashlight. They'd stolen most of our food, our Coleman stove, a lot of our tools, 3 of the backpacks, all of the girls' undergarments, and a damaged one of the tents past the point of being usable as a shelter. We were in the middle of our hike and still had another day and a half of hiking and another sleepless night to spend in the woods. My daughter and I do a girls' camping trip in Moab, Utah every year for her birthday. This year when it was cold and rainy and even snowed one night, which meant that there were not a lot of other campers. We camped by ourselves off a remote dirt road in the shadow of a giant bluff. We didn't get much hiking in the first night because it was so cold and wet. Once it warmed up the next morning, we set off to explore our surroundings. In the dirt road that went past our camp, there were giant footsteps. It looked as though some giant man ran past our camp barefoot in the night, or a Wendigo. We were convinced it was the latter. Why on earth would someone go running through the red clay in the cold of the night past a remote campsite? I needed to shit, so I went out into the woods at night away from the campsite, and I had this strange feeling something was stalking me. I hurried back and come to find out there was a mountain lion not even 10 feet from me. I found out because the people camping next to us had spotted it a couple hours before sundown. Was camping at some old horse corrals. Behind us was a creepy old outhouse in the middle of really thick timber. Completely dark, no sunlight touched it at all, and we heard weird noises coming from it during night. A few days after we left, a wildfire, the Snake River Complex wildfire in Idaho this summer, tore through there and burned the entire forest to the ground. When the fire was contained, we traveled back to the campgrounds and saw everything burned, all except for that patch of timber with the creepy outhouse. Went on a camping trip with school. Slept in massive tents that held like 7 people per tent. Woke up in the middle of the night, not sure what time, but it was late. I knew this because the campfire wasn't lit, and after we all went into our tents the teachers would stay out. So I wake up confused as shit because at the time I was a dumb kid. Suddenly I hear the most demonic screech I've ever heard. I laid back down as still as possible. Turns out other kids also heard it, and the next morning we asked the teachers what the noise was. They said it was a deer. Camping in Greece, we were the only people on the site, run by a delightful if slightly crazy lady with no teeth. After we set up our tents we went exploring a bit. We found a caravan tent that still had food on the plates outside it, and we even spied a wheelchair at the back of it. Add to that the rolls of fly-covered fly paper, and the creepy vibe was pretty intense. We continue on and find another tent. Well, what was left of it? It looked like a bear had torn it to pieces. It was in shreds and there was stuff all over. Creepy meter was off the charts at this point, so OFC we took some pics and decided to name the place Camp Death. Backpacking round Greece involved a lot of ouzo. After we got some more supplies, beer, ouzo and beans, from the local shop, we were cooking dinner and some dude in sodding biker leathers turns up and just slowly drags the shredded tent away like it's no big deal. We stayed for 2 nights and even got pissed with the owner lady and her Brazilian stray dogs on one night. We had a great time. When I was younger and we went to a camping site, at the time I was sleeping in a tent with my family. Now this tent kinda has a separation from the green sleeping area and a wide space in the middle. Anyways, at about 1 o'clock in the morning way I passed the campsite curfew, there were a bunch of so drunk men in their late 20s, maybe? Early 30s? They were older than I was at the time. Just outside our tent we hear them talking, really loudly. Then I heard glass smash, and I see through a little gap in the tent that there are about 3 dudes standing around a broken beer bottle. One of the guys opens our tent and steps inside. My dad being the hero, he was unzipped the barrier and almost sucker punched the dude in the face, but sadly couldn't as he tried to run out. Note the tried. He tripped on the tent and fell face first into the dirt. 7-year-old me and my 10-year-old brother were laughing our heads off at this dude, while my mom had a look of complete and utter shock. Last summer we bought a camper and spent the summer and fall camping all over. On one of our first trips to New Hampshire we woke up from the camper to find a huge pile of bear shit right outside the steps and in several areas of our site. Kinda freaked us out a little knowing how close a bear was. I'm an avid backpacker. I've logged over 40 days of backpacking this year, about 20 of them solo. All out west in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming. I've been woken up by a ton of crazy noises, but it's all just animals, although when you wake up your heart is racing since you can't always ID what exactly it is, and it's startling. Even if they come up to your tent, you just turn on your light and yell at them to get off and they leave. They know what you and your tent are. Most are just curious or looking for food. The more I go out the less shit bothers me. I do carry a pistol with an 800 lumen light, but it's actually people who I'm worried about. Humans are the real monsters in the dark. When I was in middle school, my whole class went on a 5-day camping trip. On the first night we set up our tents and went to bed. At about 2 or 3 a.m. I and the others in my tent woke up because some sort of large animal was poking at our tent. We also heard the sounds of wolves and heard the screaming of some kind of animal. Everyone was scared for the rest of the camping trip and we all got little to no sleep. Drifter on the trail. Right after graduating high school, me and 3 friends decided to hike the Appalachian Trail from central West Pennsylvania to New Jersey, out in the middle of THR wilderness, miles from the nearest shelter. This weather-worn man with dirty, shoulder-length hair comes rushing out of the brush onto the trail in front of us. His outfit was me-smarched hiking gear, and up close it was clear he had seen hard times. Though he was young, his hands were scarred, skin pock-marked. And around his waist, I kid you not, he had freaking a machete tied to his belt. So this fine gentleman introduced himself by the moniker Lone Wolf, and claimed he was a lost-through hiker, hiking the south to north. The fact he had no pack however was odd, but being really stupid 18-year-olds, with that sense of invisible energy common to that age, we didn't immediately get the hell away from him. He was weirdly charming, and we were kind of amused, in a perverse way. We figured he leaves us be if we were friendly, so we offered him some cigarettes. As he's smoking it, Lone Wolf starts staring at my friend one with weird looks, and making uncomfortable conversation directed at her, and only her. So we took off pretty quick and hoped that would be the last we'd see of him. Nope. 2 hours later we break for a rest on a tall rock, and to our shock, we see Lone Wolf, machete in tow, sneaking along in the brush next to the trail. We immediately double our pace hoping to lose the guy, but he managed to follow us all day. With each hour we realized beyond any doubt that he is following us, and our pace became more and more urgent. By nightfall we lost track of the drifter, but were jumping at every snapped twig and moving shadow. Hours pass and we don't see anyone, so we decide to build a fire. No one could sleep. Throughout the evening we heard the periodic sound of brush and twigs breaking beyond the firelight. Half panicking, I called out to the darkness. "Something is definitely moving just out of sight." "Hello?" The noises suddenly stopped, and I felt the sinking dread of full panic chilling my blood. I drew my utility knife, sweaty palms shaking. "We've got a gun," my friend shouts. "A lie." He reaches into his bag, and pulling the handle of a camping frying pan out, which in the dark looked vaguely gun-like. He waved around in the firelight. There was silence, then rapid crunching leaves, and the more distant sound of twigs breaking. Then silence. The next day a local ranger came up to us as we were approaching the next shelter, and asked if we'd seen a man matching Lone Wolf's description. Apparently someone had been attacked, beaten and robbed nearby. The ranger phoned the sheriff about our story and told us they'd look for the guy. The ranger saw we were shaken, and was nice enough to give us a ride up a fire trail a few miles so we could get out of the area. I still shudder think about what the guy would have done had we not scared off. Well, this was a few years ago. We, a group of friends, usually go to a farmhouse which is of a relative of our friend located inside a forest. The most beautiful place, peaceful and quiet. So we went there and put a campfire and we had few drinks. I think around past 1 a.m. IST, 3 of us went to the river located down of the farmhouse. The path only is through the forest. We stayed there for a while, went further, and as we were high, well, let's just say we were very playful, screaming and everywhere, and suddenly it felt like someone was watching us. We didn't give a thought of that and went back thinking it was the best thing to do. We are almost reaching the house and suddenly someone scolded us like, "Look at the time, is this the time to be roaming here, or go and sleep?" in a loud voice, and we all thought it was the relative, but all we could see was a black shadow. We just thought we were hammered and just went up to the house, and the awesome part, some of the friends were still at the fire camp and we looked inside the house to see the relative dead sleeping. We asked if any went by or the relative, they all said no one went from here, only you three. And it'd been over an hour. "We are waiting for you guys." Well, that made us wake up from the dizziness right away. My now spouse and I went on a canoe camping trip in the Adirondacks in October. It was colder than we expected, and rained pretty much the entire time. It was an easy trip, well within what we could handle, but didn't plan as well as we should have. We had counted on being able to find firewood but couldn't because of the rain, and even though we had enough food it wasn't really satisfying. So after a miserable couple days we were pretty cranky. The last night when we went to sleep I heard coyotes howling in the distance and was very, somewhat irrationally, aware of how vulnerable I was pressed against the side of the backpacking tent. I did manage to fall asleep only to be woken up by the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard. It sounded like an alien being murdered. It was nothing that I could connect to anything on Earth. Naturally, I woke up my spouse and told them to go see what it was. They couldn't find anything. The next day I realized that it was a loon, the warble sound, and I will never live it down. My dad was the Boy Scout leader for a few years. One time he couldn't make the whole week, so Mom went out to finish the last 2 days. I was about 6 at the time and tagged along. My brother was there so I couldn't stay home. Shortly before dawn we saw the tent flap open and one of the campers sticks his head in with a cup and says in the creepiest whisper voice, "Lemonade," then ran away. 19 years later and I still have no idea if it was lemonade or pee. Was camping a mile or so below the base of the Mount Bierstadt trailhead near Georgetown, Colorado on Guanella Pass. We were trying to get a high altitude night in before heading off to climb Mount Kilimanjaro the next week. My wife, GF at the time, and I had gotten pizza at a place on the drive there and were very careful to eat it in the car, never let it, or any other food, out of the car, and not have any food at our campsite. The plan was to camp, leave at 5 a.m., and climb Bierstadt and Mount Evans by the Sawtooth Ridge the next morning. Around some, no clue, was dark and had no watch. I hear heavy footsteps and panting. Then something starts pawing at our tent. Heavy breathing. Grunting. Heavy steps circling around our tent. Could it be a moose? No, I feel it is a bear, though a moose is honestly probably more dangerous. It's the only animal a bear is afraid of. My eyes are wide open and I assume my wife's are too. But I can't see them, pitch dark. The next morning I find out my wife slept through it. We find bear tracks all around our tent. When I was a kid, my family and I would camp put a few times a year out at my grandmother's property. It was way out in the country, in rural Indiana. My dad is a big outdoorsy guy. He isn't a hunter though. We got out there one year. This was the first time that year. We unpacked and got all set up. I helped set up, and then went off into the woods. I still love being in the woods, and even back then, I never had a fear of being in the woods, even at night. I love to hike through the woods at night, and sometimes I'd pretend I was some predatory animal and sneak around. Anyway, this was during the day. I had probably been going for an hour when I came across these deep scratch marks in a tree. They were a solid 1.5 inches deep, 4 grooves, about 2 feet long. I'd never seen anything like this before. This is in Indiana, so no bears, no mountain lions, or anything of the sort. I regarded them for a bit, and then decided it was some random thing that happened. Maybe a tree fell down, or a deer was acting strange. I kept going. It started to get dark. I didn't wear a watch, so I didn't know what time it was. This was perfectly normal for me. I always came back to the campsite. As it started getting dark, I started heading back. I was in an unfamiliar part of the woods, but for some reason, I always can find my way back. Then I come across more scratch marks. They looked similar, except these were in a tree called an Osage orange. It has extremely tough bark and wood, some of the strongest in the world. For something to do this to this strong of a tree, it had to be exceptionally strong. This time, I took it more seriously. I assumed it was some dangerous creature, and quickened my pace back to the camp. It was very dark now, the crickets were chirping away, and if I hadn't been in the woods for so long, I wouldn't have been able to see. Probably around 30 minutes later, I realized that the forest was dead silent. I had been so deep in my thoughts that I hadn't even noticed, but they had probably been silent for a few minutes. I was just really confused at why they stopped. I started looking around and moving much more quietly. This next part sounds crazy, but I promise it is true. I kept moving, very slowly, and so very quietly. I was definitely scared now. It was a novel sensation for me, being scared in the woods. A quick side note, I am and always have been an atheist, so I am not going to attribute my luck to some supernatural force or anything. Now, like I said, this sounds crazy, but hear me out. I still remember this moment like it was yesterday. I was creeping over a patch of dirt, on which it is very hard to make any sound, underneath a huge walnut tree, when all of a sudden, I heard this nearly silent sound in the branches behind me. If I hadn't been on dirt, which it is hard to step loudly on, I might not be writing this today. There was that sound, and I jumped in surprise because the woods were so quiet. Then something huge slammed into my back. I felt this sharp pain on my right shoulder, and another pain further down my arm. I was knocked to the ground, and I spun around to see what I now know was a mountain lion. I wrestled with it for a bit, and then was able to kick it off and got to my feet. I waved my arms above my head and yelled incoherently at it while moving towards a large stick. This stick was very large, but I was so charged with adrenaline that I hefted it easily, and then swung it as hard as I possibly could at the lion. I hit it square on the side and knocked it off its feet. It yowled loudly, and laid there for a moment. It was definitely dazed, probably with a few ribs broken, but I didn't stick around to examine it. I dropped the branch and took off through the woods. I don't think I have ever run so fast in my entire life. When I finally got back, my family saw how bloody I was, as did I. Noticing for the first time how injured my shoulder was, they immediately told me to get into the car, and drove to the hospital, which took 45 minutes because we were so far out in the country. I had to get surgery to fix a tendon in my shoulder. It bit right through it. My arm was okay, it was just a flesh wound from its claws. Looking back, I feel so lucky because it was undoubtedly going for my neck, and it somehow missed. A few days later, my dad read in the paper about how a mountain lion was sighted in the area where we were. A pet gotten loose, or something else, I do not know. But I haven't been in those woods since. When I was around 8 or 10, I went camping, and when it was dark I went to the nearby river to wash a bit before going to sleep. I was standing in the river with a headlight, so I turned around and saw some squiggly snake thing swimming in the water, and it scared the shit out of me. I ran out of the water to call my mom. I was in Boy Scouts for pretty much my entire childhood and adolescence. Once at a summer camp when I was 12, my friend and I snuck out of the fenced-off scout ranch area during a time when everyone else but us was in a merit badge class, so we could go hiking up this mountain we saw in the distance. Didn't tell anyone where we were going either because we weren't supposed to leave camp, Took about 20 minutes to get from the camp fence line to the top part of the mountain, and when we got to the top-ish of it we walked into this obviously man-made clearing that had 50 to 70 little lashed together stick crosses hanging from all the trees around it, like some straight up Blair Witch shit except crosses instead of stick people. We got out of there as fast as we could and back to the scout ranch, told our other friends in the troop, but they didn't believe us and we never told the adults. 3 friends and myself went camping at this campground on top of the mountains in the North Georgia Appalachians. We only had one small tent, so one friend and I slept in it and my second friend slept on the picnic table. We smoked a little bit of weed and made a big spread of the regular camping stuff. We then drank some beers and passed out, not really thinking to pick up the food around camp. I wake up to something bumping into the side of the tent, and it's big. It's met with sniffing and the sound of whatever it is chomping its teeth eating something in between large grunts. I peeked out the tent and of course it's a full-grown black bear, but that's not the worst part. It also had 2 cubs with it. I knew black bears weren't inherently dangerous but get between a mother and her cubs and they would get mean. Of course my third friend is sleeping on the picnic table and he is between us and the bear, and also in the middle of the mother and the cubs. I shake my friend in the tent awake and unzipped the zipper of the flap just a bit and see my friend on the table slowly waking up. The mother bear was turning in his direction, so I did the only thing I could think of and started to aggressively rattle the tent. This spooked the bear and her and the cubs ran off. Things could have turned out a whole lot different but we got lucky. As a person who has been camping all her life, I can tell you, as sad as it sounds, the majority of these stories about people sneaking into campsites at night are there for stealing. Close second is park rangers illegally looking for contraband. Camping equipment is expensive and a lot of it is easy to grab because it's outside unattended. We've had things stolen in the night or gone through. I will also say we have had our fair share of drunks forgetting where their campsite is, stumbling and crashing through our site. And last but not least, the nosy camp hosts or rangers that are convinced you are up to no good and think they will magically find stuff if they sneak around your shit. Now we always have night-activated trail cams when we camp with clear video and audio hidden around the site at multiple angles. That way we can leave during the day and review the footage to make sure no one messed with our stuff while we are gone, and we can make sure no one was in our site at night. Bonus videos of raccoons trying to open our cooler. Oh, I got a good one. Last year I went with a group of my close friends for a week at a public campgrounds by the beach. There was a kid who was probably around 10 and his parents next door. He was chained to a tree like a dog and we thought it was a joke at first because he was laughing with his dad, but we came back later and saw him handcuffed around the tree, yelling at his parents who were on the porch of their camper drinking and laughing. We all talked and wanted to call the cops, but by the time we decided to act on it the people left the campsite. To this day I still think about if I'm a reason a kid could have been kidnapped or if I was overthinking. Was camping with some friends and there was a bird right above our tent cawing at the top of its lungs at some ungodly hour. Eventually it stopped and I assumed it had flown off. The next morning, there was a severed bird head just on the outer boundary of our camp and we have no idea what had happened to it. We found out we were being stalked by a mountain lion. My family ended up leaving early, but my uncles stayed behind to finish off their hunting trip. He actually ended up bagging it just before it pounced. Or at least that's the way he tells it. For a bonus, he ended up propping it up with sticks near a tree and told my cousin he forgot his rifle there. Cousin nearly shit himself when his flashlight hit it. I wasn't camping, but it was somewhat similar circumstances because I lived in a rural area. I was burning a small brush pile in late July several years ago, and had waited until night because it was so hot outside already. I was near a cornfield standing away from the fire when I started to hear something shuffling through the corn. As it got closer I could tell it was large, moving slow but steady, and almost human sounding. My guess at the time was that it was an injured deer, but my mind was racing with other possibilities. When it finally emerged it turned out to be a full-grown brindle mastiff. Gorgeous, but he had clearly been lost for a while. I was going to get him some water, but he just seemed to give me a nod as a thanks for the beacon of smoke that gave him something to walk towards, then headed on his way. When I was younger my mom, little brother and myself all would travel to our relatives out in Minnesota to visit every summer. We stopped midway somewhere in the middle of nowhere, South Dakota one summer on our way out and set up camp in a camp spot of the interstate a ways. Not a tent or person in sight. Sometime in the middle of the night a vehicle drove up and parked outside our tent and left their headlights turned on at our tent. No one got out, we didn't look out, We were sure something would end badly to us. It must have stayed there with its lights on us for a good 30 minutes or more before it left. Didn't really think of that moment till this thread. It freaked us all out. I apologize for being so late to this, but I definitely have one to share. Went out to Mount Palomar near San Diego with my girlfriend, 2 friends, and their dog, a husky. One of my friends has had seasonal jobs in the National Park Service. He's very into the outdoors. He knew of a staging area that the utility company of the area, SDG&E, had up there in case they needed to store equipment for work of any kind. I think that the lot ultimately belonged to the Forest Service though, because he had a key to unlock the gate to the area so that we could park our cars in there and camp for the night, look at the stars, and enjoy each other's company. We leave to go up there on a Friday evening, sun still up, and arrive there as it is getting dark. We use 3 cars to get there, so we parked them in a triangle formation and set up tents in the middle area. Once we got that set up, we had some food, a few drinks, and started checking out the stars. I had brought a high-powered laser pointer with me, which allowed us to specifically point out constellations in the sky. My friend in the Parks Service utilized the laser pointer to give us an awesome 45-minute talk on the various constellations in the sky, and we were having a wonderful time. At this point, my other friend's dog started acting up. She only gets hostile with strangers, but the 4 of us had been accepted by her for quite a long time already, so she was not barking at any of us. We stopped and looked over towards where she was looking. We saw a figure, 30 feet away, in all dark clothes standing there. It was a man who seemed to be a bit over 6 feet tall, but he was wearing a lot of clothing. I could not make out a face or anything else identifying about him. We were taken by complete surprise that there was another person around us, but we called out and said, "Hey there, what are you doing up here?" He responded by saying that he had been given a lift by the sheriff up to the top of the mountain to spend the night up here since he didn't have a car to get all the way up here. This sounded bizarre and like something a sheriff would not do, but my friend kept up the chat. My Park Service friend slid me a knife just in case, because at this point we were all on edge. I stood in front of my girlfriend and motioned for her to get in her car while we started to get our things together. My friend with the dog was doing the talking and buffing us up with talk of me being in the military. I am not, and the other being a firefighter, also not true. We are fairly built, but he was trying to give this stranger reasons to not try his luck on whatever he was up to. We were certain he was not some drifter who had miraculously made his way up here without a car. He asked us if he could spend the night with our group and we declined. He then asked for a blanket and we also declined, and he said that he'll probably end up staying somewhere over there in Pontes towards some bushes 50 feet off or so. We said okay, we'll be here, have a nice night, and he walked off. This was a time for all of us to discuss what we wanted to do. In a clear unison, we wanted to get out of there. We all thought this stranger was full of shit. We started packing up our tents and other camping gear, and my Park Service buddy went to go unlock the gate again, which was around 300 feet away. So, it was me, my girlfriend, my buddy with the dog, and the dog. While he was unlocking the gate, the dog started acting up again. She was huffing back behind us to our left. We turned around and my friend shone a flashlight, and sure enough it was the man again. He was approaching from an angle that was certainly not from where he had walked off in. He had tried to sneak towards us from a different direction. My buddy chatted him up again while I left our ring of cars and stood facing him. I honestly cannot remember what my friend said at this point because I thought me and his dog were going to have to fight this guy off and stop him from doing whatever his intentions were. I had adrenaline pumping like I never had before. I was ready to do whatever it took to protect my friends, but he ended up walking off again. We had another stretch of time to finish getting the remaining things together. At this point, it was get things done as fast as possible. We were racing the clock against an unknown evil. We did not know what, but this man wanted to do something to us. I jogged over to my friend, who was in the process of opening the gate, to let him know we had just had a second encounter, and that we have everything packed up. I told him we need to go ASAP, so we briskly walked back to the cars, fired them up and got out of the lot, closed the gate behind us, and drove down to the left about 30 seconds or so to a closed general store, pulled into the parking lot and called 911. From my friend talking to the police, we learned that no sheriff had given anyone a ride up the mountain tonight and that it is not something they would ever really do. Confirmed suspicion of the shady character immediately from the first question. The Olive said they'd send up whoever they had available to check it out and that we should leave. After the call, We did just that. We had to head down to the right to start working our way down the mountain. On that road, we would pass underneath where we were set up at the staging area to camp. As we drove down by that area, we saw a black car parked in a turnout just below where we were earlier and a man peering over the hood of the parked car. There is a small amount of room for speculation, but who else could that have been? It had to have been the stranger. We saw that SPF got calls from the other two friends as they were driving down the mountain confirming what we saw. Took us around 20 to 30 minutes to get down the mountain and park at a gas station next to a casino down there, but we hung out there for around an hour until it was 2 a.m. to relax and let our nerves settle. It was the most comforting time I have ever had to be in a populated area again after experiencing that. If we didn't have the dog to warn us about that guy, I have no idea how that situation could have played out. None of us have ever gone back up there since. Just typing this out made my skin crawl. I have shared this story with many of my friends, but I have never written about it until now. It was a camping trip in Oregon during the summer of 1994. This was a large group comprised of family and friends. I can remember at least 8 of us being there, but there could have been a couple others. It's not important because the key events involved only 2 of us. It was myself and Paul, a friend who was a year younger. We were between the ages 15 and 17. There was a stream, Looking Glass CR, nearby, but it was 25 feet down a steep bank. Paul and I had spent the first day gathering wood and exploring the area around the main camp. Because we were teenagers, and we both considered ourselves to be tough and independent guys, we decided to set up our tent as far from the main group as possible. In reality, it was only about 100 yards away, but with the trees we were nearly out of sight from them and all we could see was their campfire at night. Also, the creek was quite loud and made it so that our tent and the main camp were not in hearing distance. The tent we set up was an old canvas army tent that had a pole in the middle. The important events happened that first night. Paul and I stayed with the main group after the sun went down, enjoying the campfire and laughter. Since we had no fire of our own, the surrounding woods were pitch black where our tent was. You needed a flashlight to walk around and not trip over something. Since we were about to call it a night, we decided to go pee at the same time. Using my flashlight, we walked towards the creek and we each picked a spot about 10 feet apart. The trees opened up a lot in this area and I was surprised that I could see the water below after I had put my flashlight into my sweatshirt pocket. After we both were done, we just stood there for a minute looking at the water. We were talking, but I can't remember what about. I thought I'd try and prank my friend, so I said, "Paul, there's something over there." Where, he asked, so I grabbed my flashlight and shine it on the path to my left. Suddenly, about 30 yards away, there are these 2 glowing eyes looking right at us. We couldn't see anything else, just those 2 glowing eyes. It seemed as though they were about the height of a large dog. Whatever it wasn't moving. Just watching. Now, when I shined my light, I wasn't expecting to see anything at all. This was a joke after all. That being the case, I wasn't thinking about what it could be. I just blurted out, "Oh my God, there is something there." And we both ran to the tent. That in itself would have made this a memorable trip, but there is a little more to this story. We were both a little freaked out, but we felt safe in the tent. We talked about what it could be and at the time we settled on coyote, but I have since changed my mind. I believe it was a cougar for a number of reasons that I won't get into. Of course, I can never know for sure. Now, we had zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags and the excitement had almost completely dissipated, and suddenly we hear something big moving towards us. It was coming from the opposite direction of the glowing eyes and our other campers. When I say something big, I mean heavy. It seemed to be stomping the ground as it walked. The noise was scary loud and it quickly came from the distance to being right outside our tent. As soon as we both heard it approach, we instantly quit talking and listened with every fiber of our existence. We were listening with our eyes blinded by the dark, with our skin from the vibrations on the ground, and with our ears that were the only way of knowing exactly where this big heavy creature was. When it came up to our tent, it stopped and got quiet for what seemed like an eternity. The only sound was 1 or 2 deep exhales. They sounded like a horse when it exhales. I was both excited and scared, and my teenage mind was just sure a bear was going to come crashing through the walls of our canvas tent. After several seconds, the eternity, it stomped all the way around our tent, all 4 sides, and without stopping again it traipsed off into the woods, going uphill in the opposite direction of the creek. These 2 events took place within 30 minutes of each other. I can't explain the big creature. My only theory, because I don't believe in Bigfoot, is that a large bull elk was moving through the area. I don't know why it was traveling in the dark around what I think must have been 10 p.m. I don't know why it was stomping its foot, or feet. And I don't know why it circled our tent. And there you have it. I'm sorry if the story climaxed and ended too abruptly, but that's how it happened. From peeing, to glowing eyes, to running away, to booming footsteps, to nothing. I think that was the strangest part of it all. Not knowing what it was, or if it would return. Paul and I don't see much of each other these days. We were best man in each other's weddings and live in different towns, but when we see each other it's always fun to reminisce about that night. I'm just months away from turning 40 and that was the most unexplained experience I have ever had. I am glad I was able to share the experience with a friend. One time, when we were sleeping, a group of wild boars attacked the camp and stole my mom's friend's shoe. I was asleep during the entire fight, but I can only imagine how scary it was for the others. Last month, I drove up to the top of a mountain near McCall, Idaho in the middle of the night in order to watch meteor showers while the moon was just a sliver. So it was very dark. Well, the dirt road at the top of this mountain was right next to a 60-foot cliff, above where we sat with other drop-offs around us. Well, my wife and I had set chairs up, but we constantly heard pebbles and rocks falling off this cliff and it sounded like animals constantly walking up behind us. Very unnerving. Well, after a few hours, we were fine ignoring those, but then we heard very low growls, large breathing that could have only been a bear or moose from below, but getting really close. We couldn't see their eyes glowing when using a flashlight though. Either way, we got to the truck and noped straight out of there. Incredible meteor showers BTW. Very memorable, but glad to have avoided whatever large animal. Not exactly creepy, but definitely scared the piss out of me. We were moving across country from Massachusetts to the Midwest and ended up in one of the many dense forests in the Pennsylvania area to camp for the night. Anyways, we drove into the campground, which was a spiraling dirt road in the dark. We were camping in our 90s era pop-up camper and were carting our dog and cat along with us. We had arrived at the actual site around 11 p.m. At first it started a light drizzle while we were setting up camp. We luckily got the camper up before it really dumped on us. It was during the summer wet season, where storms were often brutal. And brutal it was. Before we knew it, seemingly all the water in the world was dumping on us. Neither our pets or our 5 family members were excited to be stuck inside a rinky-dinky pop-up in the dead of night with booming thunder and bright lightning. Regardless, we started having fun, with card games and such. While the skies opened up above, the storm seemingly got significantly worse, driving up the level of anxiety in the space. The thunder got louder and the lightning got much closer. My father had irrational fear of lightning, which didn't help with our worry level. We began counting the miles using the thunder, until the lightning was synchronous with thunder. At this point we were in the middle of the camper, staying away from metal parts of the camper, which was currently being rocked by wind. The lightning had become so frequent, we began to have legitimate fear of being struck. All of a sudden, we smelled the strong odor of copper, to then hear the loudest thunder I had ever heard in my life directly next to our flimsy shelter, splintering what it had hit. After that, eventually the storm subsided, and we felt comfortable enough to go to sleep. In the morning, we left our camper to see severed tree limbs and discarded leaves, along with a tree not 10 feet from our camper that had been shattered at its midsection, due to the crazy force of the lightning. My girlfriend and I were camping on Labor Day. We planned on leaving Tuesday. Everyone else at the site left on Monday. It was nice to have peace and quiet. There was 2 people, each in their own site not far from us. They both stared at us every time they walked or drove by. My girlfriend was quite creeped out, but I wasn't feeling too worried. On Monday night my girlfriend woke me up saying she heard someone trying to open the tent. I grabbed her headlight, opened the tent, and pointed the light outside. I didn't see anything, so I assured her it was nothing and we both went to sleep. In the middle of the night we would occasionally hear footsteps walking really close to our tent, maybe about 10 feet or so. I was a little freaked out but knew it was other campers until the footsteps stopped, and didn't continue. I also heard what sounded like a rocking chair, moving back and forth for what felt like 2 hours. Needless to say I was super excited to walk up to bright sun on the day we were leaving. We were camping in northern Wisconsin. My sister woke me up in the early morning saying there was something outside the pop-up camper. I went out with a flashlight and a .22 pistol only to find out we had a cougar in the hammock. We checked out at sunrise and have never gone back to that place. This is assuming readers believe in the paranormal. While I was camping at Indian Mound Reservation, I was subject to ghosts. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of someone walking around the tent. This was an old-school A-frame canvas tent set up on a pallet-like platform. I also had the chills going from the bottom of my feet, up my legs and into my spine. I was in shock because it was the feeling I've gotten before at my haunted house I grew up in. I called out quietly to ask if someone was there and the walking and rustling sound paused momentarily. I then almost froze as the sound was now the sound of a slow walk into the tent. As if someone walked right in the front door. The moonlight through the crack of the tent didn't change its size, so I know it wasn't too dark to see someone walk in, because I would have seen much more light come in. The ghost walked through the tent and out the other side. My chills were gone, but I was still uneasy because I know I had just been visited. The name of the campsite is called IMR, because it's native land in Wisconsin where burial grounds are visible as mounds. I've dealt with critics my entire life. Some believe and some don't. If you don't, it's a cool story at minimum. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.